Thank you all so much. It's such an honor to be here at the Y, and thanks to Bernard for all his hard work and everybody else who's been attached to this reading. And I would also like to say thank God for Miss Nell Harper Lee. I think she's wonderful. So I'm going to begin, and then we're going to do a Q&A afterwards. So, Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow, it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oak on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slower then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Maycomb County. But it was a time vague optimism. For some of the people, Maycomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. We lived on the main residential street in town, Atticus, Jim, and I, plus Calpurnia, our cook. Jim and I found our father satisfactory. He played with us, read with us, and treated us with courteous detachment. Calpurnia was something else again. She was all angles and bones. She was nearsighted. She squinted. Her hand was wide as a bed slat and twice as hard. She was always ordering me out of the kitchen, asking me why I couldn't behave as well as Jim when she knew he was older, and called me home when I wasn't ready to come. Our battles were epic and one-sided. Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. She had been with us ever since Jem was born, and I had felt her tyrannical presence as long as I could remember. Our mother died when I was 2, so I never felt her absence. She was a Graham from Montgomery. Atticus met her when he was first elected to the state legislature. He was middle-aged then. She was 15 years his junior. Jem was the product of their first year of marriage. 4 years later, I was born. And 2 years later, our mother died from a sudden heart attack. They said it ran in her family. I did not miss her, but I think Jem did. He remembered her clearly, and sometimes in the middle of a game, he would sigh at length, then go off to play by himself behind the car house. When he was like that, I knew better than to bother him. Watchman. Since Atlanta, she had looked out the dining car window with a delight almost physical. Over her breakfast coffee, she watched the last of Georgia's hills recede and the red earth appear, and with it, tiny roofed houses set in the middle of a swept yard. And in the yards, the invisible verbena grew, surrounded by whitewashed tires. She grinned when she saw her first TV antenna atop the unpainted Negro house. As they multiplied, her joy rose. Jean Louise Finch always made this journey by air, but she decided to go by train from New York to Maycomb Junction on her 5th annual trip home. For one thing, she had the life scared out of her the last time she was on the plane. The pilot elected to fly through a tornado. For another thing, flying home meant her father rising at 3 in the morning, driving 100 miles to meet her in Mobile, and doing a full day's work afterwards. He was 72 now, and this was no longer fair. She was glad she had decided to go by train. Trains had changed since her childhood, and the novelty of the experience amused her. A fat genie of a porter materialized when she pressed a button on the wall. At her bidding, a stainless steel wash basin popped out of another wall, and there was a John one could prop her feet on. She resolved not to be intimidated by several messages stenciled around her compartment. A roomette, they called it. But when she went to bed the night before, she succeeded in folding herself up into the wall because she had ignored the injunction, pull this lever down over brackets. A situation remedied by the porter to her embarrassment, as her habit was to sleep in her pajama top. Luckily, he happened to be patrolling the corridor when the trap snapped shut with her in it. "I'll get you out, miss," he called in, answering to her pounding from within. "No, please," she said. "Just tell me how to get out." "I can do it with my back turned," he said, and did. When she awoke that morning, the train was switching and chugging into the Atlanta yards. But in obedience to another sign in her compartment, she stayed in bed until College Park flashed by. When she dressed, she put on her Maycomb clothes: gray slacks, a black sleeveless blouse, white socks, and loafers. Although it was 4 hours away, she could hear her aunt's sniff of disapproval. When she was starting on her 4th cup of coffee, the Crescent Limited honked like a giant goose at its northern mate and rambled across the Chattahoochee into Alabama. The Chattahoochee is wide, flat, and muddy. It was low today. A yellow sandbar had reduced its flow to a trickle. Perhaps it sings in the wintertime, she thought. I do not remember a line of that poem. Piping down the valley wild? Did he write to a waterfowl, or was it a waterfall? She sternly repressed a tendency to boisterousness when she reflected that Sidney Lanier must have been somewhat like her long-departed cousin Joshua Singleton St. Clair, whose private literary preserve stretched from the Black Belt to Bayou La Patrie. Jean Louise's aunt often held up Cousin Joshua to her as a family example not lightly to be discountenanced. He was a splendid figure of a man. He was a poet. He was cut off in his prime, and Jean Louise would do well to remember that he was a credit to the family. His picture did the family well. Cousin Joshua looked like a ratty Algernon Swinburne. Jean Louise smiled to herself when she remembered her father telling her the rest of it. Cousin Joshua was cut off all right, not by the hand of God, but by Caesar's hosts. When at the university, Cousin Joshua studied too hard and thought too much. In fact, he read himself straight out of the 19th century. He affected an Inverness cape and wore jack boots he had had a blacksmith make up for him of his own design. Cousin Joshua was frustrated by the authorities when he fired upon the president of the university, who, in his opinion, was little more than a sewage disposal expert. This was no doubt true, but an idle excuse for assault with a deadly weapon. After much passing around of money, cousin Joshua was moved across the tracks and placed in state accommodations for the irresponsible. There he remained for the rest of his days. They said he was reasonable in every respect until someone mentioned the president's name. Then his face would become distorted. He would assume a whooping crane attitude and hold it for 8 hours or more. And nothing and nobody would make him lower his leg until he forgot about that man. On clear days, cousin Joshua read Greek, and he left a thin volume of verse printed privately by a firm in Tuscaloosa. The poetry was so ahead of its time, no one has deciphered it yet. But Jean Louise' aunt keeps it displayed casually and prominently on a table in the living room. Jean Louise laughed out loud and then looked around to see if anyone had heard her. Her father had a way of undermining his sister's lectures on the innate superiority of any given Finch. He always told his daughter the rest of it, quietly and solemnly. But Jean Louise sometimes thought she detected an unmistakable profane glint in Atticus Finch's eyes. Or was it merely the light hitting his glasses? She never knew. The countryside and the train had subsided to a gentle roll, and she could see nothing but pasture land and black cows from her window to the horizon. She wondered why she had never thought her country beautiful. The station at Montgomery nestled in an elbow of the Alabama, and when she got off the train to stretch her legs, the returning familiar with its drabness, lights, and curious odors rose to meet her. There is something missing, she thought. Hot boxes. That's it. A man goes along under the train with a crowbar, and there is a clank and then a hiss, and white smoke comes up, and you think you're inside a chafing dish. These things run on oil now. For no reason, an ancient fear gnawed at her. She had not been in this station for 20 years, but when she was a child and went to the Capitol with Atticus, she was terrified lest the swaying train plunge down the riverbank and drown them all. But when she boarded again for home, she forgot. The train clacked through the pine forest and honked derisively at a gaily painted, bell-funneled museum piece sidetracked in a clearing. It bore the sign of a lumbering concern, and the Crescent Limited could have swallowed it whole with room to spare. Greenville, Evergreen, Maycomb Junction. She had told the conductor not to forget to let her off, and because the conductor was an elderly man, she anticipated his joke. He would rush at Maycomb Junction like a bat out of hell and stop the train a quarter of a mile past the little station, and then when he bade her goodbye, he would say he was sorry. He almost forgot. Trains changed, conductors never did. Being funny at flag stops with young ladies was a mark of the profession, and Atticus, who could predict the actions of every conductor from New Orleans to Cincinnati, would be waiting accordingly, not 6 steps away from her point of debarkation. Home was Maycomb County, a gerrymander some 70 miles long and spreading 30 miles at its widest point, a wilderness dotted with tiny settlements, the largest of which was Maycomb, the county seat. Until comparatively recently, it had history. Maycomb County was so cut off from the rest of the nation that some of its citizens, unaware of the South's political predilections over the past 90 years, still voted Republican. No trains went there. Maycomb Junction, a courtesy title, was located in Abbott County, 20 miles away. Bus service was erratic and seemed to go nowhere, but the federal government had forced a highway or two through the swamps, thus giving the citizens an opportunity for free egress. But few people took advantage of the roads, and why should they? If you did not want much, there was plenty. The county and the town were named for Colonel Mason Maycomb, a man whose misplaced self-confidence and overweening willfulness brought confusion and confoundment to all who rode with him in the Creek and Indian Wars. The territory in which he operated was vaguely hilly in the north and flat in the south, on the fringes of the coastal plain. Colonel Maycomb, convinced that Indians hated to fight on the flatland, scoured the northern reaches of the territory looking for them. When his general discovered that Maycomb was meandering in the hills while the Creeks were lurking in every pine thicket in the south, he dispatched a friendly Indian runner to Maycomb with the message, "Move south, damn you." Maycomb was convinced this was a Creek plot to trap him. Was there not a blue-eyed, red-headed devil leading them? He made the friendly Indian runner his prisoner, and he moved further north until his forces became hopelessly lost in the forest primeval, where they sat out the wars in considerable bewilderment. After enough years had passed to convince Colonel Maycomb that the message might have been genuine after all, he began a purposeful march south, and on the way his troops encountered settlers moving inland who told them that the Indian Wars were about over. The troops and the settlers were friendly enough to become Jean Louise Finch's ancestors, and the colonial Maycomb pressed on to what is now Mobile. To make sure his exploits were given due credit, recorded history's version does not coincide with the truth. But these are the facts, because they were passed down by word of mouth through the years, and every Maycombian knows them. "Get your bags, miss," the porter said. Jean Louise followed him from the lounge car to her compartment. She took $2 from her billfold, one for routine, one for releasing her last night. The train, of course, rushed like a bat out of hell past the station and came to a stop 440 yards beyond. The conductor appeared grinning, said he was sorry, he almost forgot. Jean Louise grinned back and waited impatiently for the porter to put the yellow steps in place. He handed her down, and she gave him the 2 bills. Her father was not waiting for her. She looked up the track towards the station and saw a tall man standing on a tiny platform. He jumped down and ran to meet her. He grabbed her in a bear hug, put her from him, kissed her head hard and on the mouth, and then kissed her gently. "Not here, Hank," she said, much pleased. "Hush, girl," he said, holding her face in place. "I'll kiss you on the courthouse steps if I want to." The possessor of the right to kiss her on the courthouse steps was Henry Clinton, her lifelong friend, her brother's comrade, and if he kept on kissing her like that, her husband. Love whom you will, but marry your own kind was a dictum amounting to instinct within her. Henry Clinton was Jean Louise's own kind, and now she did not consider the dictum particularly harsh. They walked arm in arm down the track to collect her suitcases. "How's Atticus?" she said. "His hands and shoulders are giving him fits today." "He can't drive then like that, can he?" Henry closed the fingers of his right hand halfway and said, "He can't close them any more than this. Miss Alexandra has to tie his shoes and button his shirts, and when they're like that, he can't even hold a razor." Jean Louise shook her head. She was too old to rail against the inequity of it, but too young to accept her father's crippling disease without putting up some kind of fight. "Isn't there anything we can do?" "You know there isn't," Henry said. "He takes 70 grains of aspirin a day, and that's all." Henry picked up her heavy suitcase, and they walked back towards the car. She wondered how she would behave when her time came to hurt all day, day in and day out. Hardly like Atticus, if you asked him how he was feeling, he would tell you, but he never complained. His disposition remained the same, so in order to find out how he was feeling, you had to ask him. The only way Henry found out about it was by accident. One day when they were in the records vault at the courthouse running a land title, Atticus hauled out a heavy mortgage book, turned stark white, and dropped it. "What's the matter?" Henry said. "Rheumatoid arthritis. Can you pick it up for me?" said Atticus. Henry asked him how long he'd had it. Atticus said 6 months. Did Jean Louise know? No. Then he'd better tell her. If you tell her, she's going to be down here trying to nurse me, and the only remedy for this is to not let it beat you. The subject was closed. "Want to drive?" said Henry. "Don't be silly," she said. Although she was a respectable driver, she hated to operate anything mechanical more complicated than a safety pin. Folding lawn chairs were a source of profound irritation to her. She had never learned to ride a bicycle or to use a typewriter. She fished with a pole. Her favorite game was golf because it essentially principle consists of a stick, a small ball, and a state of mind. With green envy, she watched Henry's effortless mastery of the automobile. Cars are his servants, she thought. Power steering? Automatic transmission, she said. You bet, he said. Well, what if everything shuts off and you don't have any gears to shift? You'd be in trouble then, wouldn't you? But everything won't shut off. How do you know? That was faith. That's what faith is. Come here. Faith is General Motors. She put her head on his shoulder. Hank, she said presently, what really happened? This was an old joke between them. A pink scar started under his right eye, hit the corner of his nose, and ran diagonally across his upper lip. Behind his lip were 6 false front teeth. Not even Jean Louise could induce him to take out and show her. He'd come home from the war with them. A German, more to express his displeasure at the end of the war than anything else, had bashed him in the face with a rifle butt. Jean Louise had chosen to think this a likely story. What with guns that shoot over the horizon, B-17s, V-bombs, and the like, Henry had probably not been within spitting distance of the Germans. Okay, honey, he said. We were down in the cellar in Berlin. Everybody had too much to drink, and a fight started. You like to hear the believable, don't you? Now will you marry me? Not yet. Why? I want to be like Dr. Schweitzer and play until I'm 30. Oh, he played all right, said Henry grimly. Jean Louise moved under his arm. You know what I mean, she said. Yes. There was no finer young man, said the people of Maycomb, than Henry Clinton. Jean Louise agreed. Henry was from the southern end of the county. His father had left his mother soon after Henry was born, and she worked night and day in her little crossroads store to send Henry through the Maycomb public schools. Henry, from the time he was 12, boarded across the street from the Finch house, and this in itself put him on a higher plane. He was his own master, free from the authority of cooks, yardmen, and parents. He was also 4 years her senior, which made a difference then. He teased her, she adored him. When he was 14, his mother died, leaving him next to nothing. Atticus Finch looked after what little money there was from the sale of the store, and her funeral expenses took most of it. He secretly supplemented it with money of his own and got Henry a job clerking at the Jitney Jungle after school. Henry graduated and went into the Army, and after the war, he went to the university and studied law. Just about this time, Jean Louise's brother dropped dead in his tracks one day, and after the nightmare of that was over, Atticus, who had always thought of leaving his practice to his son, looked around for another young man. It was natural for him to engage Henry, and in due course, Henry became Atticus's leg man, his eyes, and his hands. Henry had always respected Atticus Finch. Soon it melded into affection, and Henry regarded him as a father. He did not regard Jean Louise as a sister. In the years when he was away at the war and the university, she had turned from an overall fractious, gunslinging creature into a reasonable facsimile of a human being. He began dating her on the annual 2-week visits home. And although she still moved like a 13-year-old boy and observed most feminine adornment, he found something so intensely feminine about her that he fell in love. She was easy to look at and easy to be with most of the time, but she was in no sense of the word an easy person. She was afflicted with a restlessness of spirit he could not guess at, but he knew she was the one for him. He would protect her, he would marry her. Tired of New York, he said? No. Give me a free hand for these 2 weeks, and I'll make you tired of it. Is that an improper suggestion? Yes? Go to hell then. Henry stopped the car. He turned off the ignition switch, slew around, and looked at her. She knew when he became serious about something. His crew cut bristled like an angry brush. His face colored, and his scar reddened. Honey, do you want me to put in like a gentleman? Miss Jean Louise, I have now reached an economic status that can provide for the support of 2. I, like Israel of old, have labored 7 years in the vineyards of the university and the pastures of your daddy's office for you. I'll tell Atticus to make it 7 more. Hateful. Besides, she said, it was Jacob anyway. No, they were the same. They always changed their names every 3rd verse. How's Auntie? You know good and well she's been fine for 30 years. Don't change the subject. Jean Louise's eyebrows flicked. Henry, she said primly, I'll have an affair with you, but I won't marry you. It was exactly right. Don't be such a damn child, Louise. Henry sputtered, and forgetting the latest dispensation from General Motors, grabbed for a gear shift and stomped at the clutch. These denied him. He wrenched the ignition key violently, pressed some buttons, and the big car glided slowly and smoothly down the highway. Slow pickup, isn't it? She said. No good for city driving. Henry glared at her. What do you mean by that? In another minute, this would become a quarrel. He was serious. She'd better make him furious, thus silent, so she could think about it. Where'd you get that appalling tie? Now, she was almost in love with him. No, that's impossible, she thought. Either you are or you aren't. Love's the only thing in this world that is unequivocal. There are different kinds of love, certainly, but it's a you do or you don't proposition with them all. She was a person who, when confronted with an easy way out, always took the hard way. The easy way out of this would be to marry Hank and let him labor for her. After a few years, when the children were waist high and the man would come along whom she should have married in the first place, there would be searching of hearts, fevers and frets, and long looks at each other on the post office step, and misery for everybody. The hollering and the high-mindedness over, all that would be left would be another shabby little affair a la Birmingham Country Club set. And a self-constructed private Gehenna that with the latest Westinghouse appliances. Hank didn't deserve that. No, for the present, she would pursue the stony path of spinsterhood. She set about restoring peace and honor. Honey, I'm truly sorry, she said, and she was. That's okay, said Henry, and slapped her knee. It's just that I could kill you sometimes. I know, I'm hateful. Henry looked at her. You're an odd one, sweet. You can't disassemble. She looked at him. What are you talking about? Well, as a general rule, most women, before they've got them, present to their men smiling, agreeable faces. They hide their thoughts. You now, when you're feeling hateful, honey, you are hateful. Isn't it fair for a man to be able to see what he's letting himself in for? Yes, but don't you see you'll never catch a man that way? She bit her tongue on the obvious and said, how do I go about being an enchantress? Henry warmed to the subject. At 30, he was an advisor, maybe because he was a lawyer. First, he said dispassionately, hold your tongue. Don't argue with a man, especially when you know you can beat him. Smile a lot, make him feel big, tell him how wonderful he is, and wait on him. She smiled brilliantly and said, Hank, I agree with everything you said. You are the most perspicacious individual I've met in years, and you are 6'5", and may I light your cigarette? How's that? Awful. They were friends again. Thank you. I was telling them earlier that I haven't read anything out loud for that long since 30 years ago when my kids were little, so I'm sorry if it wasn't as smooth as I wanted it to be.
So what's more perfect than a grown-up scout reading a grown-up scout?
Thank you.
Mary, did you ever wonder what happened to, I know that Harper Lee gets letters constantly saying what happened to Scout, did she become a lawyer, what happened to her? Did you spend any time on that question? Did you ever think about what happened to Scout?
Yeah, I wondered, and I figured she probably went into law and, became a lawyer like her dad and, was out fighting the good fight, But, I just didn't know for sure.
So we know from the novel, The Ghost Set of Watchmen, that Scout moved to New York, Justice, and works here. We're not quite clear what she does from the novel. And as Harper Lee did, she lived in New York City at the time. And we also know that Harper Lee sort of lived in the hood around here in the Upper East Side. And of course, then, you begin to wonder, could she have ever come to the Y? Because it certainly would have been, Truman Capote read In Cold Blood here. It certainly would have been the kind of thing she might have done. Well, I'm happy to tell you that in the book, there is a clue. Jean Louise is walking around town, and she does, on page 177, people are constantly saying to her, well, how's New York? And Jean Louise replies, New York, New York. I'll tell you how New York is. New York has all the answers. People go to the YMHA, the English-speaking Union, Carnegie Hall, the New School for Social Research, and find the answers. So there's a little local sidebar for you.
Is that my copy?
It is. I stole your copy. Sorry. I just had to check it while I was there. So,
It's like
My new pride and joy.
Sorry.
My baby.
I just needed to be sure I had the right page.
Yeah,
So
right.
what is your response to Jean Louise of Go Set a Watchman? Knowing Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird as well as you do.
She is just fabulous. She is still pushing buttons every time she gets a chance, and very passionate about her beliefs. And I think everybody's going to really enjoy this book. I think everybody should read this book. I think it's so timely for right now. Mockingbird came at a perfect time for our country. It allowed us the ability to discuss subjects rationally and intelligently without getting way up here. And now that things are way up here with our country, I think this will help a lot.
I've seen you were talking to Katie Couric about Atticus and his portrayal. Much is being made of several sentences that Atticus utters in Go Set a Watchman. You've read the whole book. Mm-hmm. What's your feeling about the portrayal of Atticus?
What you have to do is you have to put your mindset in that time period, okay? And you have to understand what we lived through. I, being from Alabama, can testify to this about the way you presented at home and the way you may have to present in public. If I had ever said the N-word in my household, lye soap would have quickly gone down my throat. It was not something that one said. You were taught to be respectful and understanding. And when you read the book, you'll get it.
It's not, the 4 sentences aren't all there is to the story.
There is so much more to this. And how many of us, when we were 20-something, thought we just knew it all, right? We were so smart. You know, you come home from college, you're like, ah, you know, and you go with your parents, you know, and you're like, oh, this and that, blah, blah, blah. And I was studying Russian history, I can remember, and my dad's going, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So.
Here's, we're getting questions from the audience. So this person didn't give me a name on the card, but the question is, how has playing Scout positively impacted your life? And did it in any way negatively impact your life?
It positively affected my life in the fact that in doing this, you know, if I'd have stayed in Birmingham, Alabama, I'd have probably become a product of Birmingham, Alabama. But as it was, I was able to travel, go to California. California and Alabama were like 2 different countries. In California, everybody got along, everybody was just an individual, and black and white, Latino, whatever, Oriental, it didn't matter. And everybody sort of got along, and we would go to people's houses and they would come and visit with us, and no problem. Well, then I go back to Alabama and I have to conform to all the rules and regs that the white man wants, because I'm a white woman, I'm a Southern woman, and I got to conform. You know, you got to do things right. How are you going to get a husband otherwise? Well, I didn't quite conform, ever.
So that world of femininity that the grown-up Jean Louise despises and the young Scout despises.
It was totally me. I mean, I grew up, you know, in a house full of boys, my nephews and my brothers, and whatever they were doing, that's what I was doing. If they were going out in the woods playing, we went out and made forts and did whatever. And
climbing in tires, rolling down the street.
Climbing in trees, falling out.
This next question is from Trevor, way in the back, and you're going to want to see where he is when you hear the question. I'm lucky enough to work on the Universal lot in California once a month. I always take a golf cart and drive past Boo Radley's house. What do you remember most about the set? P.S. The tree is still there. Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks, Trevor. Yeah. This set that you see, Boo Radley's house evidently is the only one that's left, because we were doing a shoot for Vanity Fair. Went out to California, and limo driver brings us out, and he's talking about how he has been doing this for so long and just loves the street. And we pull up, and he goes, "How does it feel to be home?" And I'm looking around, and I'm like, I don't recognize anything. And it got me real choked up. And I stepped out of the limousine and started to cry. And this guy comes up behind me, and he puts his arm around me, and he said, "They didn't tell you, did they?" And I said, "Nope." And he said, "One of the guards became disgruntled, burned down 3/4 of the back lot at Universal Studios, and this street was one of the first ones he torched. Your house was one of them." I had come to the studio, my brother John Badham, that some of you probably know, Saturday Night Fever, whose life is director, yeah. He was making a picture with Goldie Hawn called Bird on a Wire. And he said, "Why don't you come over to the lot and take a visit with us, and we'll go out to lunch with Goldie," and that. I said, "Great." So I had my little pass in my purse, and I go over to the studio, and I'm digging in my purse for the pass, and I hear this very broad Scottish accent going, "Mary Badham!" And I went, "Oh my God." And I look over, and it's Scotty from the gate, the guard, when I was at Universal Studios. He was still there, Well, I throw the thing in park, and I jump out, and it's like, "Oh, Scotty, blah, blah, blah." Meanwhile, all these people are trying to get back into the studio that have gone out for lunch, and I'm holding up the whole shebang. And I told Scotty, I said, "Scotty, I'm thinking about going back to the old back lot." And he said, "No, best leave your memories where they are, love." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I gathered there was some change, so I didn't push the issue. And it wasn't until years later, when I did the Vanity Fair shoot, that I found out what happened. So, but
How long were you on the set? I mean, how long were you?
it was about 5 months that we took to film this. They took their time with it. And see, Philip and I were non-actors. We'd never done anything before. Now, me, because my dad had always wanted a little girl and had to wait through all these ratty boys. And then, finally at 60 years old, he gets his little girl and then doesn't know what to do with her. But anyway, I forget where I was.
Well, I was asking how long, and I guess the question is, the other question is, how aware of the plot were you? Did you know exactly, because you were a small child, for instance, did you know what the charge was? And
I don't think we even got complete scripts. I think they gave us just what we needed to know and the bare minimum.
So what did you think the movie was about?
Well, I kind of knew, sort of, that there was a trial. He was defending somebody, he lost, blah, blah, blah. I knew that. But as far as detailed stuff, no. And as kids, we're not interested in that stuff anyway.
So here's a new question from an audience member. What was it like to work with Robert Duvall? Was he friendly with the child actors?
I only got to work with him like, I think one day, maybe two. And I never saw him out of costume. We never saw anybody out of makeup until they were all done shooting with them and everything. And I was leaving the set one day. I had to leave the set and go out and around to go back to the schoolroom for classes as soon as they were done filming with me. So there's a pile of pallets, and this guy is sitting on there, and he's got two little chippies on either side. And I didn't really pay much attention to him. I'm headed to school because, man, if you were late, Ms. Grokey was going to eat you up, man. She was like really strict. And he goes, "Aren't you going to say hey to Boo?" And I looked over.
Boo-hoo.
I was like, I had no clue who this guy was. But we were together not long ago. He and his wife have started a foundation for children. And it's really, really great. And I got to go up to the farm and visit with them. And they're just so dear. It's great.
Don't they sort of live near?
Yeah, they're just like a
near you.
couple hours away, maybe an hour and 45 minutes, something like that.
Do you have a memory of any particular line or scene that you found just very difficult, or a line you couldn't learn, or?
Yeah, I had difficulty with the very last scene that we shot, and that was the jailhouse scene. I had no trouble with my lines up until that day. And I knew that this was the very last day of shooting. Now, I had had nothing but fun the whole entire time. I was having a blast. Didn't have to, deal with a whole lot. You just have fun. And we went to do that scene, and for some reason, I just could not spit the lines out. Because I knew at the end of this day, I was going to have to say goodbye to all these people that I'd fallen in love with. They were like family to me. You don't work very closely for 5 months with people without becoming very, very attached. And so I just couldn't get it right. Bob Mulligan calls cut, let's take a break. And so I go back to my trailer, and my mother's standing there in the doorway of the trailer waiting for me. "Young lady, do you know it's almost 5 o'clock? Do you know what the freeway is like at 5 o'clock? These people want to go home. Do you know how much money it's costing every minute that we're on overtime, "Okay, yes ma'am, okay, I got it, I'll go back." So I finally was able to get back there and spit it all out.
And is that, "Hey, Mr. Cunningham, I know your boy Walter"?
Yeah, that whole mob scene thing, and it was a tough scene to shoot, and I was so bad. Oh my God, the poor man who I had to kick in the leg was an ex-highway patrol officer. He had been in a motorcycle accident and lost a leg. "Mary, make sure you don't kick this leg. Kick this one. This one's the fake one. You can't hurt that one. You can kick it as hard as you want."
Ruh-roh.
Oh, which leg did Mary choose to kick? Oh.
Here's a question from Robin Jones in the audience. Do you remember your first meeting with Ms. Harper Lee? Would you mind sharing your strongest memory of that meeting?
I think it was on the porch. We did a photo shoot around the swing, I think.
Well, there are those photos.
There are those photos. I had no real memory of it until seeing the photos. That really brought it back. But what she said to me, what I said to her, I have not a clue. Not a clue.
But you've seen her other times.
Oh, yeah, since then. I mean, it's so funny because there's all these stories about, Miss Nell, and, she doesn't want to see anybody, and she's a very private person, blah, blah, blah. I'd heard all this stuff, and I believed it, so I didn't press the issue, and I was down in Monroeville, and I kind of tentatively put it out there that I'd kind of like to go by and see Miss Nell and say hello. Well, they told me how to get to the house, and I drove over there, and there was a car from Mississippi in the driveway, and I chickened out. I turned around and went back. So I didn't go that day, but went to see her in the nursing home, and I told her, I said, Miss Nell, I'd heard all these stories about you that you don't like, interference and, to do. And she says, young lady, don't you ever come by here and don't say hey to me. Yes, ma'am, you got it. No problem. I can do that. So ever since then, everything's been fine.
Another question from the audience. Tell us about your Atticus.
My Atticus. My Atticus was the most wonderful man. Gregory Peck was truly Atticus. What we got at home was what you see up on the screen. He was kind and loving, and he listened. He didn't ever preach at us. He talked with us, not to us. There's a difference. And he always made us feel loved and appreciated. And he was just incredible. I mean, he was one of the best daddies in the world. And I lost my parents very early in my life. My mother died 3 weeks after I graduated from high school. And my dad died 2 years after I got married. And I didn't get married till I was 21 because I promised my daddy I wouldn't. But losing both my parents so early in my life, Veronique and Atticus really stepped up to the plate and helped me through a lot of stuff. And it was nothing for me to pick up the phone. What you doing, kiddo? You studying hard? What you reading? He was just great like that. And I often joke with people that I had reverse Oreo daddies.
Oh, my.
And I mean by that my dear Brock Peters, who played Tom Robinson, was my other daddy. And he also really helped in my, being a role model for me as a parent. So I had my daddy and Gregory Peck and Brock Peters. So my reverse Oreo daddies.
Did it take you a while? You were a young, you were a child, and did it take you a while to understand that you had been part of something huge that had a tremendous impact that people were still talking about? I'm sure 20 years after you'd been in the movie. And I know it took you a while to read the book, too.
I didn't read the book until after I had my daughter. But in defense of myself, how many of you have seen a film and then you read the book and it totally changes your whole opinion about the whole thing? I had my whole little world up there in black and white, and I really didn't want it schmutzed with. I really loved everything about it, and I wanted to keep those memories intact. And I get a call from Professor Inge over at the college, and he said, will you please come to my English Lit class and talk to him about Mockingbird? So I don't know what I'm going to talk to his English Lit class about, but okay. He said, well, let's meet for lunch, and we'll go over the details. Okay. Well, before I could even get seated at the table, he's like, so what was your favorite chapter in the book? I guess he could tell by the look on my face. I hadn't read the book. Young lady, your first assignment is you go home and you read this book. Yes, sir. Okay, I can do that. So I go, and here's all these people that I had no knowledge of. And
Oh,
much
all the
deeper
minor characters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Dolphus, Raymond.
Aunt Alexandra, you know, none of those people that I have any inkling of before. So it was really great to read the book, and then you get so much more insight on Boo and Miss Maudie and all these other characters that were so pivotal in the film.
So you spend a lot of time going to classrooms, talking to kids. Here's a question from a middle school teacher in the Bronx, and she who says, "My kids,
Brave woman you are,
my
Amanda,
kids
whoever.
love To Kill a Mockingbird. When we finish the unit, I guess that's how teachers,
Yes.
right? I always pose the question."
Teacher speak.
In 20 or 30 years, what will you remember about To Kill a Mockingbird? And the question asked of you is, what will you remember about To Kill a Mockingbird?
Boy, that's a big question. It seems like a simple question, but it's not. I think To Kill a Mockingbird is such a great teaching tool. It has all of life's lessons condensed into this one little simple book. And it says it in such a way that we can hear it, if you know what I mean by hearing it. And I think I'll remember the love of all the people that I've met, that I've worked with, as I've traveled around the world with this book and this film. It's impacted my life in a growth process to accept the world and to be tolerant of people and other ways of thinking and other ways of doing things.
You've read Go Set a Watchman.
Yep.
Do you think it will be taught in schools?
I certainly hope so.
Why? What is it that
I think,
that English teachers are going to want to?
well, I think it especially now with what we've got going on in this country. In the last 2 weeks, we've had major things come up on these issues of race and tolerance and bigotry and stuff. And it all comes down to education. I tell the schools all the time, and I make the kids say it and then scream it. And I want you guys to say it too, and see if you agree with me first. The root of all evil is ignorance. Would you agree with that? Let's say that all together. Ignorance is the root of all evil. Okay? And education is the key to freedom. Education is the key to freedom.
I'm not sure everyone here has had a chance to do their speed reading of Go Set a Watchman. Can you speak to anything, any chapter, anything in the book that particularly that you want to share?
Oh, well, I can't really go because a lot of you haven't read it. I don't want to give anything away.
Well, for instance, Scout gets, just for instance, Scout gets a little drunk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a little.
Just a little. She hasn't changed a whole lot through the years. I mean, usually when you have a personality, you kind of hang on to it through the years, and so you're gonna see Scout just in a more adult form.
Just 3 fingers of whiskey. Nothing much.
But it knocks her socks off. It's good. This book has so much humor in it, okay? I mean, there's stuff that will make you cry, one minute with upset, and then they're like with the first chapter that I just read to you. I got it and I was so excited about it, and one of my gals in the office, I was reading it out loud to her and got real choked up and had to stop when she said that Jim had died. That I wasn't ready for. That just really hit me so hard. And then the next minute, you know, screaming, both of us with laughter and having tears streaming down our faces over some of the other bits of it. It's just, she can do that. She can take you from high to low in a half a second. You know, it's just, it's really brilliantly written. And some of it is so poetic. It's so beautiful.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to say goodnight and to thank you, Mary, for letting us hear Scout's voice again.
Thank you.